At first glance, the life of a monk in ancient Japan might seem like the epitome of peace. A silent temple nestled in the mountains, incense drifting through pine-scented air, days spent in quiet meditation and prayer. But that vision, however comforting, is only part of the truth. The deeper reality was far more complex, and often far less tranquil. Before we go further, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights, settle in, and if you're enjoying these quiet, immersive journeys through the past, consider subscribing. It really helps support the channel. And hey, only if you feel like it. Maybe drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see where in the world these quiet corners of history reach. Now take a slow breath, and let's begin. Long before the sun rose, the monk's day had already begun. Sleep was a luxury, not a guarantee. They would rise in near total darkness, roused by the dull clang of a temple bell echoing through cold stone halls. The floor beneath them was hard and biting, woven straw mats over wooden boards that offered no real warmth, only discipline. Monks didn't ease into the day. There was no lingering in bed, no slow stretch toward wakefulness. You got up immediately, because hesitation wasn't just frowned upon, it was corrected. There were rules for everything. How you stepped out of bed, how you folded your robes, how you walked, even how you breathed. Order wasn't suggested, it was absolute. Life in the monastery wasn't designed for comfort. It was a test of endurance, of devotion, of letting go of the self. But that process of letting go didn't come with serenity. It came with repetition, deprivation, and often pain. Meals were sparse. Breakfast might be a thin rice gruel served in silence, with vegetables pickled in brine so strong it made your mouth ache. Talking during meals was forbidden. Every movement, from lifting your bowl to setting it down, was prescribed, practiced, and expected to be perfect. And if you made a mistake, you weren't corrected with a gentle word. You were met with a wooden stick, sometimes across the shoulders, sometimes across the back. But the physical discomfort was only part of the reality. There was also the cold. Monasteries, especially in the mountains, were brutally frigid during the winter months. There was no heating, no fire in your room, just layers of robes and the quiet ache of trying to meditate while your fingers went numb. And during summer, the heat could be equally punishing. Thick robes soaking with sweat as insects buzzed relentlessly through the air. Monks didn't live alone. They lived as part of a strict hierarchy. Senior monks watched everything. Junior monks cleaned, fetched, and followed orders without question. You were never truly alone, and you were never truly safe from criticism, discipline, or judgment. The monastery didn't just house spiritual seekers. It bred warriors of the mind, and sometimes even warriors of the body, because despite what we imagine, not all monks were passive or pacifist. Some belonged to militant sects. Some trained in martial arts, wielded weapons, even fought in battles to defend their temples or assert their sect's power. These were known as soothe, warrior monks. They wore armor beneath their robes. They carried naginata, staves, or swords, and they knew how to use them. So, no, being a monk in ancient Japan wasn't peaceful in the way we might picture. It was rigorous, restrictive, exhausting, and in many cases, dangerous. And that's just the beginning. Life inside the monastery moved beneath a silence so complete, it didn't feel like quiet. It felt like pressure. A stillness that sat on your shoulders, pressed behind your eyes, and wrapped itself around your lungs. Speaking wasn't discouraged. It was nearly forbidden. Days blurred together with no more than a handful of shared words, often limited to chants, formal responses during rituals, or a brief instruction from a senior monk. For someone new, that silence could be terrifying. Without distraction, your mind had no place to run. Memories, guilt, desires, They surged to the front like intruders in a locked room, and no one helped you process them. You were expected to observe, endure, and overcome. After the morning bell rang, the routine began. Prayer, cleaning, meditation, done with precision and discipline. Then came labor. Monks weren't contemplative poets lounging by scenic koi ponds. They were workers. They built, cooked, mended, farmed, hauled, swept, split, planted. Monasteries had to feed and clothe their members without outside help, which meant every pair of hands mattered. You didn't specialize. You did whatever needed doing. That might mean sloshing through frozen mud to harvest vegetables, or climbing a rickety ladder to fix a leaking roof. All in silence. All under observation. Correction when it came was immediate. Not brutal, but unrelenting. If you left a tool out of place, if you dragged your feet during sweeping, if your chanting was lazy or your posture slouched, expect the keisaku. The flat stick used by senior monks was not for torture, but for awakening. It snapped against your shoulder or back with a sharp sting that said, "Pay attention." It didn't wound, but it humbled. By the time midday approached, the chill might ease, just a little. You lined up for the second meal, another modest serving of gruel or rice, perhaps with boiled greens or pickled radish if it was available. No one talked. No one reached for seconds. The food was bland and minimal. Salt and oil were luxuries. Fullness wasn't the goal. Balance was. To feed the body just enough so the mind could function. Appetite was another craving to suppress. Afternoons weren't easier. Meditation resumed. But don't imagine monks in deep peace, floating in serenity. It was mental combat. You sat perfectly still, back upright, legs folded painfully tight as time crept forward in slow motion. Your knees throbbed. Your feet went numb. Your mind darted and fidgeted. You were trained to observe without reacting, not to drift, not to chase thoughts, not to escape into fantasy, to just be. And it was harder than any physical labor. Some were assigned to script work, copying texts, writing sutras, practicing calligraphy. It looked serene. It wasn't. Each character had to be perfect. Each line was a reflection of your discipline. Make a mistake, and start again. The goal wasn't beauty. It was exactness. Training the hand to obey the mind. Training the mind to quiet itself. All of it, the work, the meals, the posture, the breathing, was structured by bells. They rang not just to wake or to pray, but to define your entire reality. There were no clocks, no spontaneity, no personal rhythm, only the sound of brass echoing across the stone, telling you when to sit, when to move, when to stop. It was like being inside a living machine, one designed not to comfort, but to transform. This wasn't a peaceful life. It was a stripped-down, grinding pursuit of clarity, a relentless discipline meant to carve away every distraction, every weakness, every trace of ego. Some monks grew within it. Some found resilience, even joy in surrendering to the order. Others broke. Quietly, completely. And when the next dawn came, the same bell would ring, calling everyone to begin again, no matter how tired, how sore, or how lost they felt. If you arrived at the monastery thinking you were escaping the chaos of the world, what you found instead was another kind of storm, internal, quiet, and constant. The isolation wasn't just from the outside world, but from your former self. Upon entry, your name might be changed. Your head was shaved, often ceremonially. Your identity, once shaped by family, work, or ambition, was now stripped down to the barest form. You weren't expected to bring anything with you. No opinions, no baggage, no desires. The life you had before was treated like a hallucination, a passing illusion. And in its place came the unbending present. Wake, pray, work, meditate, sleep, over and over, without end. Evenings were when the silence deepened like a well with no bottom. The sky outside turned ink black beyond the latticework of wooden windows, and inside the monastery glowed dimly under the flicker of oil lamps or guttering candles. There were no stories shared to end the day, no songs sung softly in groups, no bursts of laughter echoing through stone corridors, just footsteps sliding across wooden floors, just the soft hiss of robes brushing past each other. You washed using cold water from a shallow basin, dressed in the same plain robes worn every day, folded your bedding with precise corners, and bowed toward your sleeping space before lying down. Even rest had form and discipline, your posture, your position, your breathing, all part of the routine. Dreams weren't discussed. Suffering wasn't shared aloud. You were taught not to fight your pain, but to observe it, as though watching a stranger's struggle. If you missed your family, if you remembered a lover, if you felt rage or jealousy, fear or sorrow, you were to let it pass. No clinging, no rejection, just observe. Let it go. That was the mantra whispered by the mind. Some monks wrote down forbidden thoughts in secret, scrawling them in the margins of scrolls or hiding scraps of parchment inside old prayer books. Others carved tiny figures out of twigs or bits of stone, tokens from a different life, silent talismans of what they once had. These small rebellions were rarely discovered, but when they were, the consequences weren't brutal. They were exact, extra chores, longer meditation, a public correction delivered with calm authority, not to shame, but to realign you, to bring you back into form. At night, the walls of the monastery seemed to breathe around you. The wind moved through the rafters like a distant voice. Wood creaked under its own age. Somewhere far off, the echo of chanting still rang in your ears, a memory of prayer that never really stopped. Your body ached from kneeling and scrubbing, sitting and standing. Sleep came not like a reward, but like a necessity your body eventually demanded. The floor was hard, the air cold, and in that dark stillness, even the most devout monk could feel his thoughts begin to drift to a warm hearth, the curve of a loved one's face, or the comforting sound of rain hitting a tiled roof far away. But exhaustion always won. You'd fall asleep, not into peace, into pause, because soon before dawn broke the sky, the bell would ring again. And everything you were, everything you carried, would be expected to vanish back into the rhythm of the next day. There was no finish line in the monastery, no final arrival, only more letting go, more silence, and the quiet repetition of surrendering the self to something bigger and colder than understanding. Monks in ancient Japan didn't wake up gently or at their leisure. There were no soft sunrises or stretches beneath cozy blankets. Their mornings began in the thick, suffocating darkness, long before the first hints of dawn painted the temple walls. A jarring wooden clapper, or the low, soul-rattling toll of a gong shattered the silence, reverberating through the cold, narrow hallways with a sense of absolute finality. This wasn't a gentle awakening, it was a summons, a demand. And once it sounded, you moved without question. Fast. Their sleeping arrangements were Spartan to the point of cruelty. Thin straw mats laid directly on aging wooden floors, creaking with every movement, packed tightly together in rigid rows. No pillows, no blankets, no privacy. Just you, the rough texture of your robes, and the relentless cold that slipped through every crack in the timber walls. The nights were long and restless. You lay still, wrapped tightly in layers that barely kept out the chill, trying to ignore the gnawing ache in your knees, or the hollow pit in your stomach. The air was filled with every tiny sound, barely audible coughs, the whisper of wind outside, the soft rustle of robes. Sleep didn't bring peace. It brought brief, shallow escape. When the signal to rise came, there was no hesitation. You sat up immediately, folded your bedding with rigid precision into a neat, compact square, and turned to bow toward the altar, your first obligation of the day. Then came the silent procession to the main hall. The wooden floor bit at your bare feet, and the air, icy and unwelcoming, filled your lungs with every careful breath. Talking was strictly forbidden. Even glances were discouraged. The silence wasn't contemplative, it was disciplinary, heavy like a stone pressing on your chest, reinforcing the loss of self. The day began with chanting. Not a few minutes of soft recitation, but hours. Long, rhythmic sutras repeated over and over in deep, droning unison. The texts were in ancient Chinese or Sanskrit, languages most of the monks didn't fully grasp. But comprehension wasn't the point. It was about repetition, discipline, and the extinguishing of ego. You knelt on unyielding wooden floors, back straight, eyes unmoving. The pain set in gradually, your legs numb, your joints locking, your throat growing raw. Your voice had to remain steady. Your thoughts couldn't wander. And what did you get for enduring it all? More chanting. Next came cleaning, but not a symbolic gesture of purification. This was punishing, exhaustive labor. Monks scrubbed temple floors until they gleamed, hauled heavy buckets of freezing water from far-off wells, swept wide courtyards, wiped down every wooden beam and sliding door, polished statues until their arms trembled. Every task had to be executed flawlessly. Every motion was deliberate. There was no room for error, no chance for relaxation. The cold sank into your skin. Your knees throbbed from kneeling. Your spine ached from hours of bending. But no one spoke. No one sighed. You just worked. Eventually, finally, there was breakfast. But there were no comforts to be found in it. A single bowl of watery rice gruel, warm enough to keep your fingers from going numb, sometimes accompanied by a few bitter pickled vegetables, if supplies allowed. Eating was done with military precision. You bowed before lifting your bowl, held your chopsticks in a prescribed way, chewed silently, and kept your gaze low. There was no idle chatter, no laughter, no sound, except for the gentle clink of bowls and the hum of breath. Eating was not about nourishment. It was about ritual, and any hint of enjoyment was considered a failure. Pleasure was temptation. Attachment was weakness. And this was only the beginning. The sun still hovered below the horizon. Your muscles already throbbed with fatigue. And the most grueling parts of the day, the mental drills, the theological instruction, the meditation marathons, still loomed ahead. The life of a monk in ancient Japan wasn't calm. It wasn't blissful. It was relentless, a fire that burned away the self, hour by silent hour, until only obedience remained. In the world of ancient Japanese monasteries, silence wasn't merely golden. It was doctrine, mandate, and shield. Speaking wasn't just discouraged, it was suppressed. Many Buddhist orders implemented strict rules of verbal abstinence, believing that silence cultivated discipline, sharpened awareness, and subdued the ego. But for the monks who lived by this code, especially the younger novices, it was more than a spiritual guideline. It was an emotional crucible. Words were rationed like precious resources. Conversation was limited to essentials, and even those were often delivered in hushed tones or encoded glances. Some temples allowed hand signals or small slips of paper, but many discouraged even these. The aim wasn't serenity, it was control, not peace, but precision. The point was to strip you of distraction, of indulgence, of spontaneous thought. You learned, over time, to listen more than you spoke, to anticipate rather than ask, to repress rather than react. You learned to fold your restlessness into neat corners within your mind. This wasn't meditation under a cherry blossom tree. This was a daily battle with your own impulses. If you were frustrated, you swallowed it. If you were joyful, you tempered it. If you were confused, you puzzled it out in silence. And the silence itself wasn't empty. It had weight. It hovered in the halls, seeped into the wood, pressed against your chest. It made your thoughts louder, your doubts sharper, your weaknesses more vivid. Even humor had boundaries so tight they might as well have been bars. A smile too wide, a laugh too hearty, a joke too irreverent. These could all be seen as breaches in discipline. Fun was a threat to focus. Monks were encouraged to train the mind not to entertain itself, but to overcome itself. Talking about the weather, about dreams, about old memories. These were viewed as distractions. Everything was supposed to circle back to mindfulness, to awareness, to the extinguishing of self. And then there was hierarchy. Strict, unyielding, unspoken, but omnipresent. Senior monks held sway over novices with a glance. You were expected to intuit correction from a look, to learn from the absence of instruction. Discipline could come in many forms. A slight shake of the head, a sudden assignment of extra chores, or physical punishment dealt without a word. Respect wasn't requested. It was expected. And novices weren't students. They were vessels to be emptied and refilled with obedience. Monastic training wasn't a curriculum. It was erosion. It wore you down through repetition, austerity, and ritual. Bowing, walking, eating, every action had a correct form. And if you placed your sandals an inch out of line at the threshold of the temple, someone noticed. Someone corrected you. Not always with patience. From the outside, a temple might seem like a tranquil retreat. Stone paths winding through whispering bamboo, koi drifting in quiet ponds, the soft chime of a bell in the distance. But for the monks inside, the peace was maintained through relentless structure. It wasn't nature. It was discipline wearing a mask of calm. Surveillance wasn't technological, but spiritual and social. Your peers watched you. Your elders judged you. Even the idea of the ancestors loomed ever-present like eyes in the rafters. Every day was a test not of muscle or strength, but of submission and stillness. You weren't just fighting worldly desires. You were fighting yourself. You were trained not to conquer, but to dissolve. And though the temple promised enlightenment, the road to it was narrow, winding, and full of invisible thorns. The silence you carried wasn't peace. It was pressure, a pressure that never lifted, a silence that demanded everything. The temple grounds were quiet, but not silent. The soft shuffle of sandals across worn stone paths echoed faintly, interrupted by the gentle rustle of wind in the pine trees, the occasional creak of ancient wooden gates, or the chirp of a distant bird hidden in the high branches. A monk walking the perimeter might hear the clink of a bell tied to the tail of a roaming cat, or the low, steady rhythm of a wooden mallet pounding rice in preparation for the next day's meals. Life in the monastery didn't stand still. It moved with intention, with quiet persistence, in cycles as dependable and ancient as the moon. By this point in the day, most of the monks had already completed their morning rituals. These included seated meditation before dawn, chanting sutras as incense smoke curled skyward, and performing their temple chores with unwavering focus. Every action was purposeful, every movement deliberate. They didn't speak unless absolutely necessary. Silence wasn't so much enforced as it was embodied. A monk could go days, even weeks, without saying more than a few words. Instead, they learned to communicate with body language, subtle gestures, bowed heads, and calm, unwavering eyes. The self, as most people knew it, was gradually dissolved. Their identities were worn down like river stones, replaced with discipline, humility, and a quiet devotion to repetition and service. Those assigned to the kitchen, a respected and deeply spiritual position known as tenzo, now prepared the midday meal. It wasn't just a task, but a sacred practice. Every slice of a daikon, every rinse of a rice bowl, was performed with full awareness. Cooking was meditation. Every movement mirrored the values of patience and gratitude. The meals themselves were humble: boiled radishes, steamed millet, soft tofu, seasonal greens gathered from the temple gardens. Flavor was not the goal. Mindfulness was. Nothing was wasted. Vegetable peels were added to broth. Rinse water was used to clean tools or nourish plants. Food was not taken for granted. It was treated with reverence, as if each grain of rice carried 1,000 silent blessings. Outside, young monks worked the temple gardens, their knees sunk deep in dark soil, fingers sore and cracked from hours of weeding and planting. They whispered thanks to the earth, not for show, but because gratitude was stitched into every breath. These weren't breaks from practice. They were the practice. Zen taught that there was no line between the sacred and the mundane. Everything was sacred. Sweeping leaves from the courtyard was as important as chanting in the main hall. Scrubbing a toilet was no less noble than copying an ancient scroll with perfect, ink-stained brushstrokes. And yet, behind the surface serenity, there was constant physical and mental exertion. Backs ached from hours of seated meditation. Feet blistered from long walks in straw sandals. Sleep was minimal and broken by early rising bells. But this wasn't suffering for suffering's sake. It wasn't punishment. It was transformation. The discipline wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to humble, to dissolve the illusion of separateness. The individual didn't matter. Only the collective mattered. The temple, the sangha, the path. This wasn't peace the way most people imagine it. It wasn't comfort or stillness or safety. It was peace through elimination. The gradual, unrelenting removal of ego, of comfort, of distraction. And, in its place, clarity, repetition, silence. The slow, deliberate rhythm of a life stripped of excess and boiled down to its elemental truth. By the time the sun had fully climbed above the treetops, the monastery had already sunk deep into its rhythm, and the outside world felt more like a distant memory than a neighboring reality. For the monks of ancient Japan, life wasn't divided by clocks or calendars. It was sculpted by rituals. It didn't matter if the sky was blue or stormy, if the wind howled or the air stood still. The flow of time was marked by chants, chores, prayers, and practice. To live in the temple was to dissolve the self into something greater. And that process began the moment your eyes opened. One of the most physically taxing and often overlooked aspects of that rigid daily cycle was the relentless maintenance of the temple grounds. To an outsider, sweeping stone paths or trimming branches might sound peaceful, even serene, a poetic union of man and nature. And yes, in spirit it was meant to be meditative, but in truth, it was back-breaking work dressed in sacred robes. The brooms were handmade from twigs and straw, the axes were dull, the floors were endless. And nature? Nature was not cooperative. The seasons brought no mercy. Summer turned the robes into heavy blankets soaked in sweat. The sun bore down without kindness. Winters, on the other hand, stiffened your fingers, cracked your heels, and iced over the water you had to haul before dawn. There was mud. There was frost. There were bugs, biting, buzzing, endless. Moss never stopped creeping up temple stones. Bamboo pierced the soil like spears, and fallen leaves rained down like they were mocking your progress. The youngest monks, those still learning to discipline their bodies and minds, were often given the most grueling tasks. These were the chores that seasoned monks had endured for years and were now passing on as a form of tradition, or perhaps survival. Young initiates hauled buckets of water from far-off springs, sometimes climbing steep paths in the dark just to reach them. They scrubbed floorboards by hand until their knees blistered and their backs cramped. Firewood didn't split itself, and it certainly didn't stack neatly. They did that too, even when the wind cut through their robes like knives. And sweeping? It wasn't just for cleanliness. The gravel paths had to be kept pristine, an aesthetic reflection of inner order, even in the pouring rain, even in the snow. You might sweep a path clean only to turn around and see it covered again, as if the earth itself was testing your patience. You'd sweep it again, and again, until your arms felt like lead. No praise came. No one clapped. You'd get a silent nod. Maybe. Then you'd do it all again tomorrow. And that was just for the temples surrounded by gardens. If your monastery maintained its own rice fields, common for self-sustaining temples, the demands multiplied. Farming wasn't decorative or optional. It was survival. The monks tilled soil, planted rows of seedlings, and harvested grain with aching backs and dirt-crusted hands. Bent over for hours in fields of mud, sweating through their robes, bitten by insects and burned by the sun. It was a kind of devotion that bypassed words. But all of it, the sweeping, the hauling, the planting, was just one layer of a much deeper discipline. Every task was meant to dissolve the ego. Every act, no matter how repetitive or punishing, was a tool for introspection. The goal wasn't just a clean path or a stocked firewood shed. It was silence, humility, a kind of emptiness that cleared the way for spiritual awakening. But still, aching muscles didn't care about enlightenment. Bleeding fingers didn't magically stop hurting because they were part of a ritual. You weren't allowed to complain. You weren't supposed to even feel frustrated. The ideal monk found serenity in repetition, joy in monotony. But ideals are rarely reality. Many young monks struggled. Some never adjusted. They endured the work in silence, carrying their discomfort like a secret failure. Because, for all its spiritual aims, temple life was no escape. In ancient Japan, to be a monk wasn't to hide from suffering. It was to confront it daily, with your hands, your body, your breath, and to bow your head and keep going. Outside the monastery walls, life was far from tranquil. While the Western imagination often paints monks as secluded and serene, the reality for many monks in ancient Japan, especially during the feudal period, was that they were anything but isolated from the chaos of the world. In truth, the outside world frequently stormed in uninvited and full of turmoil, pushing monks into roles that required more than prayer and quiet meditation. Monks had to be alert, armed with more than scripture, and ready to face threats that didn't come in the form of spiritual doubt. Japanese monasteries weren't just spiritual havens tucked away from worldly concerns. They were major landholders and influential socio-political entities. Many temples amassed incredible wealth through extensive rice-growing territories, tenant farmers, artisan production, and donations from pilgrims hoping to earn karmic merit. The accumulation of sacred relics also made these sites magnets for spiritual tourism and commerce, but also invited the unwanted attention of robbers, power-hungry daimyos, and ambitious warlords. In some cases, monasteries rivaled or even exceeded the economic and military clout of regional lords, making them key players in the delicate and often violent power struggles of medieval Japan. Some Buddhist sects, especially the Tendai and Shingon schools, saw the rise of the Sohei, warrior monks trained in the art of combat. These were not isolated outliers or rogue actors. They were organized, disciplined, and trained like professional soldiers, dressed in armor layered over their religious robes, wielding naginata, pole arms, bows, and swords. They participated in everything from local defense to full-scale civil wars. Their presence on the battlefield was not rare. It was routine. These monks didn't merely defend temple grounds from brigands or rogue samurai. They launched military campaigns, fought in dynastic disputes, and played decisive roles in shaping political landscapes. Some even laid siege to castles or went head-to-head with imperial forces. But warfare wasn't the only battlefield. The the political arena was just as brutal. Many monks served as counselors and diplomats, leveraging their perceived neutrality and religious clout to influence nobles, shoguns, and emperors. With the right words in the right ears, a monk could alter the fate of a province. Their sermons carried political weight, and temple alliances could tip regional balances of power. But their influence was precarious. Fall out of favor and a temple could be razed to ashes. A single misstep, real or perceived, could result in exile, imprisonment, or execution. The robes offered no protection from political retribution. Even the seemingly spiritual act of pilgrimage was laced with danger. Travel across Japan in those days was treacherous. Roads were unreliable, often little more than dirt paths winding through forests thick with thieves and wild animals. Monks traveling for study, teaching, or to spread doctrine risked starvation, disease, assault, and sometimes death. The sacred duty to learn and teach demanded resilience. For many, each journey was an act of physical and spiritual fortitude, undertaken with the full knowledge that they might never return. So while modern minds may conjure peaceful images of quiet temples, echoing chants and gentle steps on polished wood floors, the full picture of monkhood in ancient Japan is far more complex. These monks were not just guardians of inner peace. They were defenders of territory, wielders of influence, soldiers of philosophy, and at times, martyrs to their cause. Their days were filled with strategy as much as scripture. Underneath the soft robes lay hardened resolve, and sometimes literal armor. The monk's path wasn't just contemplative, it was combative, commanding, and dangerously alive in the shifting sands of feudal Japan. As the seasons shifted and the years crept slowly forward, the life of a monk in ancient Japan didn't become easier. It became heavier. The silence felt thicker. The routines, once merely rigid, became almost suffocating. And the expectations, sharpened by time, carved deeper into every aspect of daily life. By this stage, a monk would no longer be a wide-eyed novice fumbling through ritual. He'd be established in the hierarchy, yet that didn't mean he held any real power. What came with seniority wasn't ease, it was responsibility. And with responsibility came pressure, both external and internal. In this rigid world, time wasn't your own. Each day was divided into segments so precise that the ringing of bells across the temple grounds felt like commands etched in stone. They dictated everything: when to wake, when to bow, when to recite sutras, when to work, when to sit still, and when to move. There was no such thing as spontaneity. You didn't take impromptu walks or skip meditation because you were exhausted or change the schedule because you weren't feeling well. A sore throat didn't excuse you from chanting. An aching back didn't shorten your kneeling time. If your joints screamed during long meditations, that wasn't a problem to fix. It was a challenge to embrace. Meals followed the same rhythm day after day. Each bowl held the same contents: plain rice, steamed greens, thin miso soup, no meat, no sugar, no indulgence. The food was simple, functional. Pleasure had no place at the table, but the kitchen was still a place of ritual. Every monk, regardless of rank, took turns preparing meals, and the act of cooking wasn't a task, it was a meditation. Chopping vegetables required precision. Washing grains took focus. Stirring a pot was a test of attention. If your mind drifted while you sliced a daikon, that failure would show in your work. Even a crooked slice could draw correction from a senior monk. Outside the temple's thick wooden gates, the world churned. Daimyo fought over land. Peasants worked until their hands cracked open. Travelers passed along trade routes, bringing news and rumors. But inside the temple, time didn't churn. It circled. Seasons rolled by, marked not by events, but by chores. Cherry blossoms bloomed, fell, and were swept away by quiet hands. Snow drifted down, and monks rose in the cold dark to shovel paths in their bare feet. Days blurred together into decades of sameness. There was a certain beauty to it, a serenity in the pattern, but also a kind of slow erosion of individuality. Over time, discipline wasn't something you practiced. It became who you were. Fatigue wasn't an excuse. It was a reason to bow deeper. Illness wasn't a hindrance. It was a test of your resolve. Your body, that flawed vessel of impermanence, was to be ignored or endured. Your knees might ache from endless kneeling. Your spine might curve from too many hours bent over sacred texts. Your hands might crack from cleaning in winter winds. But you didn't complain. You pulled your robe tighter. You took a deeper breath. You accepted and carried on. But spiritual growth wasn't the only thing demanded of you. As your experience grew, so did your responsibilities. You were expected to guide novices, transcribe important scriptures by hand, perform rituals for local villagers, care for sick elders, and take on leadership roles during temple events. With age came not rest, but service. Seniority didn't mean comfort, it meant duty, and often that duty came with a quiet, unspoken burden that you carried alone. Beyond the temple gates, the world moved to a rhythm utterly unlike the still, contemplative life behind monastery walls. It pulsed with conflict, ambition, hunger, and unpredictability. Outside the temple, there were no sacred hours, no polished floors to sweep, no gongs to measure the passage of time. Only the raw, relentless pace of human struggle. When monks were sent into this outside world, by duty, misfortune, or decree, they stepped not into a peaceful realm awaiting their presence, but into a churning sea that neither paused nor parted for the hem of a robe. There were many reasons a monk might leave the temple. Some were chosen to carry messages between distant monasteries, journeys that wound through mountain passes, across wind-swept valleys, and along paths barely more than goat trails. They walked through snowstorms, thunderstorms, scorching heat. Each step was part prayer, part trial. Others were sent to remote villages where they performed blessings for harvests, recited sutras for the dead, or tried to soothe fears during outbreaks of disease or after earthquakes and floods. These weren't just errands. They were tests of endurance and resolve, with the ever-present threat of failure. The road was never safe. Bandits stalked trade routes, targeting travelers who looked too humble to resist, but valuable enough to be worth the risk. Wild animals, boars, wolves, even bears, roamed freely, and monks were not always welcomed with open arms. In some provinces, rival Buddhist sects vied for influence, and their followers saw unfamiliar monks as threats. In others, local lords treated temple envoys as political pawns, useful only if they offered loyalty or leverage. At times, monks were swept up in conflicts they neither started nor wanted. A feudal lord might seek their presence to legitimize a decision. A monastery might be forced to defend its lands against tax collectors or neighboring estates. A quiet village visit could spiral into a tense standoff between factions. Monks were meant to be spiritual anchors, but the world often saw them as negotiators, witnesses, or even pawns in games they didn't wish to play. Even without political entanglements, the world beyond the cloistered halls tempted in subtler ways. A humble inn offering warm rice and sake, the flicker of firelight and easy conversation with travelers, a woman's laughter across the room, the smell of grilled fish, a night under the stars that made the temple's roof feel like a prison. The robes didn't guard against desire. The precepts didn't silence longing. And the farther one walked from the temple, the louder those temptations seemed to whisper. Some monks, after weeks or months on the road, found themselves haunted by doubts. Was seclusion truly the highest path? Was turning away from the world an act of courage or cowardice? Could one find enlightenment only in solitude? Or was it forged in the suffering and struggle of life among others? These questions weren't always spoken aloud, but they surfaced nonetheless. born from fatigue, hunger, fear, and fleeting joy. The world didn't ask for permission to challenge your beliefs. It simply did. Returning to the temple, then, was not always a return to peace. The familiar rhythm of the bell felt different. The once soothing silence now rang hollow, echoing with memories of voices, footsteps, arguments, kindness. They bowed at the altar as before. They sat in meditation as they always had. But something inside them had shifted. They were still monks, yes, but not quite the same monks who had left. What they had seen could not be unseen. What they had felt could not be dismissed. The world outside had seeped into their marrow, and even as they resumed their duties, a part of them stood forever just beyond the gates, listening to the wind. The monastery at dawn was a place of contradiction. On the surface, there was silence, a quiet so deep it pressed against your chest like a held breath. But underneath, life stirred in meticulous, deliberate motion. The faint rustle of sandals brushing against the gravel paths, the soft clink of ceramic bowls stacked neatly for the morning gruel, the low, steady murmur of prayer echoing from the inner sanctum, each syllable a drop of sound in the stillness. A monk's morning didn't begin with choices. It began with obedience, routine etched deeper than thought. Before the sun crested the curved, tiled rooftops, bodies were already moving with choreographed precision, honed by repetition and reverence. Some monks swept the stone courtyards with handmade straw brooms, the bristles barely whispering as they traced familiar paths. Others lit incense at the main altar, fingers practiced and steady, their movements as exacting as any ritual. In the kitchen, steam rose thick and steady as a handful of novices hunched over large, iron pots, stirring thin rice porridge. The scent mingled with cedar smoke and sandalwood, curling toward the temple beams above. There were no greetings, no idle chatter. Speech was rationed like precious water, a privilege, not a habit. Every action, no matter how small, was an act of devotion. Washing your face, bowing to a senior monk, straightening a crooked stone on the temple path. Each moment held its own purpose, its own gravity. There was a rhythm to it all, and the rhythm did not wait. You didn't drag your feet. You didn't linger in bed or pause to stretch. Not unless you wanted to be corrected. Gently in some monasteries, with silent disapproval in others, or more directly with the sharp slap of a bamboo stick. Meals were taken in silence, a ritual in themselves. Rows of monks sat cross-legged on low wooden platforms, robes arranged precisely, eating with slow, deliberate motions. The food was plain: a bowl of rice, boiled greens, perhaps a sliver of pickled radish or fermented root. Seconds were neither encouraged nor refused outright, but rarely pursued. Gratitude was shown not with words, but with posture and discipline. You didn't rush. You didn't waste. Every grain mattered. Each bite reminded you, this body is not for pleasure. It is a vessel for discipline. After the meal, bowls were rinsed in shared basins, the water growing cloudy and warm. They were dried with thin cloths and returned to their designated places with care. There was no chaos, no confusion, only order. Then came scripture, not simply reading, but chanting. Monks sat in rows, their voices rising and falling in rhythmic cadence as they recited sacred texts for hours. The sound echoed through wooden halls and open courtyards like an unbroken wave. Understanding was not always the point. Presence was, endurance was, to lose the boundaries of the self and become part of a collective breath, a collective voice, a collective will. Monastic life in ancient Japan was not a retreat from the world. It was a crucible, a regimen of service, silence, and self-erasure. As the sun climbed higher over the monastery walls, it brought no pause, no moment of leisure, only continuation, the same steps, the same repetitions, the same quiet internal war to extinguish desire, to quiet the ego, to offer your life to something greater. One breath at a time. The temple bell echoed once, deep and deliberate, before dissolving into silence. The morning rituals had drawn to a close, and slowly, like fog retreating from a hillside, the monks dispersed into the rhythm of their daily routines. Their robes rustled softly against the gravel, brushing past low pine branches and stone lanterns slick with dew. A few monks, heads bowed in focus, balanced heavy wooden buckets filled with cold water from the well, moving in perfect synchrony. Others swept the temple paths with deliberate, meditative strokes, using hand-bound brooms to tame the scattered leaves and dust. Each motion was both a task and a lesson, a quiet resistance against the pull of distraction. But one monk did not move. He remained kneeling in the main hall, motionless before the altar's flickering candles. His name no longer mattered. He had let it go 3 winters ago, when he took the vow of silence. A surrender, not just of speech, but of self. Since that day, words had passed his lips only in chants carried on incense-scented breath, whispered like offerings to the divine. Yet today, long after the others had stepped away, he stayed behind. Not to pray, not to chant, but to remember, his knees pressed into the tatami mat, aching. The cold from the floor crept into his bones, tracing old lines of pain up his back. Still, he remained. The air around him thickened with incense, bitter, sharp, grounding. It swirled through golden shafts of sunlight that filtered in through narrow wooden slats, drawing pale lines across the floor. The scent was no longer unfamiliar. It was the smell of memory, of discipline, of wounds that never stopped aching. Beyond the temple walls, the world continued without pause. Rice paddies awaited planting in the valley below. Scrolls curled gently on wooden desks, awaiting translation or copying. Roofs strained under the weight of age and weather, begging to be mended. Students fidgeted in the study halls, their minds drifting while teachers recited the sutras. All of it, each crack in the roof tile, each errant whisper, demanded attention. And yet, here he sat, unmoving, spine straight, eyes lowered. Stillness, he had come to learn, was not surrender. It was resistance. Before these robes, before the shaved head, before the early bells and fasting bowls, he had been a soldier, a man of sharp blades and harder choices. That chapter lay deep beneath the surface now, buried under years of silence and routine. But it had not vanished. The scar that stretched across his left hand pulsed when storms rolled in. His right shoulder still clicked with the memory of a fractured collarbone from a battle long past. And sometimes at night, the dreams came without warning. Iron, meeting iron. Men screaming in agony, the bitter stink of smoke and blood. He had not come to the temple seeking forgiveness. He had come because he understood. Silence was not the absence of noise. It was a discipline, a blade forged to face the chaos within. It required strength to hold still when memory demanded motion. It required courage to let go of the sword and lift the broom. The temple had not erased his past. It had simply wrapped it in cedar and incense and given it space to echo without rage. He shifted, a motion barely noticeable. A bow, low and slow, not to any relic or idol, but to the silence itself, to the stillness that had become his truest teacher, the one that never softened, never relented. Outside, a softer bell chimed, the signal to rejoin the others. The hour had turned, and duty awaited. Yet he lingered a moment more, inhaling slowly, exhaling deliberately, not clinging, not resisting, just present. A monk, yes, but beneath the layers of cloth and ritual he remained what he always was, a man trying to lay down his past, one breath at a time. A memory shaped by fire, slowly being cooled by stillness. The ritual of the monastery didn't pause for pain. Even when a monk was sick, injured, or simply worn down to the bone, the rhythm of the day marched forward without mercy. The temple bell didn't care if your joints ached, if your head throbbed like a war drum, or if your muscles burned from days of labor. The chant must be sung. The floor must be swept. The prayers must be recited. There was no negotiation, no compromise. And so, hour after hour, day after day, the cycle continued, unyielding, sacred, and inescapable. Life in the monastery was a loop, drawn so tight it left no space for comfort. If your hands were blistered from endless work, you learned to grip tools differently, wrapping the splinters with cloth if you were lucky. If your voice cracked during morning sutras, you still had to sing, matching the rhythm, tone, and cadence drilled into you through countless mornings. There was no room for excuses, no allowance for pause. To stop was to fall behind, and falling behind brought a quiet kind of punishment. Not loud, not cruel, just subtle. The silent glances, the absence of eye contact, the stillness in the room when you entered, the feeling that your presence had become not just unwelcome, but disruptive. The world of the monastery didn't punish with whips. It punished with discipline, precision, expectation. Every action was a reflection of your inner self. Spill water from a bowl, and it meant your mind was scattered. Speak out of turn, and it meant your spirit lacked restraint. Monks policed themselves more harshly than any outside force ever could. That's what years of repetition did. It carved into you a quiet fear, not of violence, but of failure, of being seen as unfocused, of not being enough, of dishonoring the order not through sin, but through sloppiness. And yet, amid the grind of perfection, the monastery still demanded humility. Pride was a sickness, vanity a poison. If you thought too highly of your own chanting, if you walked a little too tall after completing a difficult scripture or finishing your chores with speed, you might find yourself reassigned to cleaning latrines or gathering firewood in the rain and wind. It was never spoken aloud, but everyone understood. The monastery had ways of reminding you that the work mattered more than the one doing it, that you were a vessel, not the water, that silence and invisibility were virtues, not punishments. Meals were another test. Monks ate in silence, seated on low platforms, heads bowed. The food was plain: boiled rice, miso, sometimes barley, and maybe pickled vegetables if the temple had been well supplied that season. Each bite was measured, not just in portion, but in attitude. You didn't eat fast, or slowly, or greedily. You ate mindfully, respectfully, as if the bowl in front of you had taken a lifetime to reach your hands. Because in some ways, it had. The growing, harvesting, preparing, all done by hands like yours, bound by the same rules. The food was nourishment, yes, but also a lesson, a reflection of simplicity and shared effort. Evenings didn't bring freedom, only another phase of the cycle. Lanterns were lit with careful hands. The air grew colder, the scent of wax and wood smoke mixing with the chill. Shadows stretched long across the courtyard stones. Some monks studied texts by dim candlelight, their eyes straining against the inked brushstrokes of ancient teachers, their fingers tracing the words as if trying to memorize not just the meanings, but the intentions behind them. Others meditated until their legs went numb, trying to clear minds that had been racing since sunrise. Some did both, moving from study to stillness as the night deepened. Sleep, when it came, was short and dreamless. A few hours at best, enough to keep the body standing, never enough to rest the soul. And through it all there was the silence, heavy, constant, a silence that could feel like a balm or a burden depending on the moment, a silence that held space for every doubt, every ache, every unanswered question. It filled the halls, the gardens, the spaces between breaths. It became a companion, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel, but always there. There was peace in this life, yes, but it was not handed to you. You had to earn it, through effort, through endurance, through absolute surrender, not just once, but every single day, without end. Peace, here, wasn't a gift. It was a discipline, a destination you reached not by dreaming, but by walking through the fire of repetition and ritual, with your eyes open and your voice steady. The temple bell tolled long before the sun began to rise, not as a gentle summons, but as a stark reminder. The monks should already be awake, already present in body and mind. In this world, there was no such thing as sleeping in. Rest was not a comfort, but a calculated necessity, kept brief, dreamless, and disciplined. The life of a monk was not one of tranquil mornings and leisurely introspection. It was rigor, silence, and the tireless pursuit of presence. Even before the first pale light stretched timidly over the distant mountains, the monastery was already alive with the whisper of ritual. By then, the monks had finished their first cleansing. Icy water from mountain-fed basins slapped their skin awake. They moved with silent precision through narrow, dimly lit corridors, bowing at thresholds, adjusting robes, falling into formation. There were no sleepy conversations, no grumbles, no delays. Each motion was practiced, each step intentional. Soon they filed into the zendo, the meditation hall, where stillness awaited, not as comfort, but as challenge. To an outsider, seated meditation might appear serene, an act of peace. But inside this space, it was a battleground. You sat, motionless, spine straight, knees screaming from strain, and the floor beneath you, unforgiving. There were no cushions, only tightly woven straw mats that pressed and bit into your flesh. You faced a wall or the back of another monk, but the real opponent was within. Your thoughts itched, surged, nagged. The urge to shift, to scratch, to slump, all had to be denied. And if you slipped, if you let your body betray your mind, let your chin dip, or your thoughts stray too obviously, a supervising monk would be watching, always. He moved silently with a keisaku, a flat wooden stick used not with anger, but with purpose. One sharp, resounding strike across the shoulders snapped you back to focus. It was not punishment. It was redirection, a visceral reminder, return to breath, return to now. This wasn't a retreat. It was discipline, training, a relentless drill to face silence like a soldier faces fire. You learned to sit with pain, to outlast hunger, to navigate boredom without flinching. No ticking clocks, no passing distractions. Time unfolded in long stretches of mental combat, broken only by the structured transitions of the day, labor, study, and more meditation. And from the outside, it might have looked like peace. But inside, it roared. After meditation came chanting. Monks moved like a tide into the chanting hall, rows forming, postures set. Sutras were recited in low, steady unison. The voices blended into a sound that wasn't quite melody and wasn't meant to be. It was rhythm, grounding, a monotone hum meant to silence the ego and tame the wandering mind. No one spoke out of turn. No one improvised. Mouths moved together. Thoughts, ideally, did not. Yet, even amid the rhythm, the body resisted. Knees continued to ache. Backs stiffened. Throats dried from the repetition. Eyes blinked heavy with exhaustion. But still, no one broke. To fall out of rhythm, to shift ungracefully, to stand when others remained seated, these were transgressions, not just against the self, but against the group. Discipline was communal. To falter was to invite shame. And in a life devoted to shedding the self, shame still clung like a second robe. When the bell finally rang again, it wasn't release. It was reordering. One ritual yielded to another. Stillness gave way to movement. Med. The rhythm of temple life might have appeared tranquil from the outside. peaceful courtyards, soft footsteps on wooden floors, the gentle rustle of robes. But within the high stone walls of ancient Japanese monasteries, life was anything but serene. The daily routine was strict, physically punishing, and mentally exhausting. The pursuit of enlightenment demanded more than prayer and contemplation. It required the total surrender of self, your time, your body, and even your thoughts. Life as a monk was about absolute mastery, not just of doctrine, but of desire, identity, and ego. And that meant living by a schedule so tight, it left little space to simply breathe. A monk's day began in the depth of night, long before the first glow of dawn touched the tiled roofs. The wake-up bell, sharp, cold, and unrelenting, rang through the sleeping quarters, pulling men from thin straw mats into cold darkness. There were no soft transitions, no second chances. You rose immediately. You moved deliberately. Silence was not just a rule. It was a law. From the moment your eyes opened to the moment they closed again, you were observed. And you knew it. Every movement, every hesitation, every flicker of emotion was under scrutiny. You weren't just training your mind. You were erasing it. After a few minutes to dress and ready yourself, the day moved quickly into its first act. Morning prayers. Long sessions of recitation and chanting, performed in freezing halls where breath formed fog in the air. These prayers were not optional, nor were they expressive. They were exact. Recited syllables in unison, repeated until the voice wasn't yours anymore, it was the temple's. You didn't chant to understand. You chanted to disappear, to let your voice become an echo of the past. Next came cleaning. Every surface, every corridor, every stone path was swept, scrubbed, or dusted. But not as a chore. This wasn't about hygiene. It was about humility. Cleaning wasn't done to finish a task, but to practice presence. You didn't rush. You didn't complain. Whether you were wiping soot from an altar or scraping moss from a stone step, you did it with the same focus, the same reverence, the same quiet surrender. Cleanliness was spiritual, and through it, monks cleansed the ego. Hours of scripture study followed. Sutras were memorized, copied by hand, recited aloud. Ancient Chinese texts were dissected line by line. Debates were held under the critical gaze of teachers who did not tolerate vagueness or arrogance. Every answer was an opportunity to expose weakness. You didn't argue to win. You argued to peel back illusion, to strip away the false certainty that clouded truth. Mistakes were corrected with precision, sometimes with sternness, occasionally with silence, more cutting than words. Meals came at precise intervals, and even eating was a ritualized event. Monks gathered on the floor in rigid rows, each one handling their bowl and chopsticks as though performing a sacred rite. The food, plain rice, boiled vegetables, pickled roots, was eaten slowly and in total silence. Before and after the meal, there were bows, thanks, and chants. You didn't eat for pleasure. You ate to sustain discipline, to practice detachment. Every bite reminded you of the body's needs and your duty not to be enslaved by them. The afternoons were filled with physical labor, carrying wood, tending vegetable gardens, fetching water from streams often at a distance, repairing temple walls. Some tasks were heavy, others tedious, but all were essential, and all were expected to be completed without question, without rest. Labor was meditation in motion, a chance to test endurance, obedience, and patience. Muscles ached, backs strained, yet you did not complain. Complaining showed attachment, and attachment was weakness. As twilight crept across the sky, the final hours were for zazen, seated meditation. This was the crucible, the real test. Sitting cross-legged in silence for hours, the body protested. Knees burned, backs locked. Sweat formed on brows despite the cool evening air. And yet, you didn't move. You didn't shift. You watched your thoughts rise and fall like breath. You were not your pain. You were not your fear. You were not your name. In that stillness, you practiced death. The death of ego, of distraction, of identity. When night finally descended and sleep was allowed, it came in the form of brief, dreamless surrender. You laid your mat with care, bowed once, pulled a thin blanket over your frame, and drifted off into silence. Not rest, not comfort, just silence. This was not a life of ease. It was a life forged in restraint, repetition, and reverence. Every moment was a confrontation with self. Every breath a choice to surrender. In the end, a monk wasn't meant to be someone. He was meant to become no one. A vessel emptied of self, filled only with the quiet pulse of devotion and the eternal echo of discipline. The temple bell echoed softly through the morning mist, a low metallic hum that rolled across the tiled rooftops and disappeared into the forest beyond. Its resonance was slow and deliberate, like a breath held in reverence and then exhaled across the stillness of dawn. By the 16th year of monastic life, a monk's daily routine hadn't changed much, but his body certainly had. Knees ached from decades of kneeling, the joints now stiff and reluctant to bend as they once had. Backs had stiffened from hours spent hunched over scrolls or bowed in silent devotion. Hands that had once turned pages with ease were now calloused and rough, the skin worn thin from cold air and years of repetition. And yet, every morning, the rhythm continued. The body aged, but the schedule did not flinch. It didn't acknowledge discomfort. It simply persisted. In the temple garden, the monk crouched low to the earth, his movements slow and deliberate, pulling weeds from around the root vegetables with a practiced touch. The soil was damp and cool beneath his fingernails, clinging stubbornly to his skin. As a light rain began to fall, his robes darkened and clung to him heavily at the shoulders and back. Still, he didn't pause. There was no time to wait out the rain. The vegetables had to be inspected for pests. The gravel path swept clean of creeping moss, and the rain barrels carefully managed to avoid overflow. Weather was never a reason to stop. Fatigue was even less of one. Inside the main hall, another monk moved in practiced silence, lighting incense at the altar. The smoke spiraled upward, pale and fragrant, twisting into invisible patterns that caught the dim, filtered light coming through the paper screens. The room smelled of pine wood and damp stone, of old varnish and the faint sweetness of burning herbs. It was a scent so deeply woven into the space that it felt like memory more than aroma. Candles were trimmed and replaced. Tatami mats were swept with care. The ancient sutras, delicate and irreplaceable, were checked page by page for signs of mold or insects. Every hour passed like water over stone, gradual, quiet, but never idle. Time didn't move fast. It moved thoroughly. Meals were unchanged, simple, quiet, and ritualistic. A bowl of rice, a few pickled vegetables, miso broth occasionally flecked with seaweed. But even these humble meals had changed in meaning. Bites were smaller now. Chewing was slower, more mindful. Digestion came with more effort. A stomach that once ignored hunger now reacted sharply to every splash of vinegar or overly cold drink. The body had softened with age and then hardened again, not with muscle, but with habit, with resilience built on daily endurance. Meals weren't about hunger anymore. They were about precision, about attention, about maintaining a connection between body and will. Evening prayers arrived like a familiar shadow, cast not with fear, but with a worn, respectful understanding. The chants, recited for decades, had settled deep into the bones. They lived beneath the skin, in the lungs, in the rhythm of breath. Each syllable became less about its literal meaning and more about what it represented: time passing, memory kept, devotion sustained. Sometimes the monk wasn't sure what he was praying for anymore. Not health, not wisdom, not even peace. Sometimes it felt like the prayers were meant simply to hold the act of prayer itself, to keep the pattern alive, to stay sharp through repetition, to remember how to continue. Monastic life didn't offer clarity as a reward. It offered repetition, the same stones beneath your feet, the same wind rustling the eaves, the same chants echoing across generations. But repetition wasn't emptiness. It was a kind of deep endurance, a meditation carved out over years, like a river smoothing stone. It didn't promise enlightenment. It promised rhythm, persistence, and the slow unfolding of a different kind of wisdom. After so many seasons within the same walls, the silence didn't grow louder. It deepened, and in its depth, so did the monk. The monastery garden had no shortage of silence, but it wasn't the serene kind you might expect. It was the silence of breath held too long, of thoughts too loud, of footsteps deliberately soft. Here, monks walked the same gravel paths every day, tracing the same patterns around the same withered pine tree, listening for answers that never came. It was said that tending a garden was a form of prayer. In reality, it was an exercise in patience and control. The soil, like everything else in the monastery, had to obey. Raked gravel lines were kept crisp and perfect, disturbed only by the wind or an errant leaf. Even then, they were swiftly corrected. The rhythm of the rake, scraping through the stones, echoed like a heartbeat. Steady, repetitive, meditative, or maddening. You could lose hours in that sound. That was the point. Gardening wasn't about beauty. It wasn't even about growth. It was about discipline. You shaped the landscape the way you tried to shape your mind, clearing, cutting, focusing, smoothing. Pulling weeds became a metaphor for uprooting your own thoughts. Trimming branches was a reminder to cut away desire. But metaphors grow heavy when your back aches and your knees are damp and cold from kneeling. And not every monk believed in the metaphor. Some gritted their teeth through the task, not out of enlightenment, but obligation. The garden had rules, just like the kitchen, just like the prayer hall. You worked in silence. You used only the tools allowed. You didn't complain when the wind undid an hour of careful raking. You simply began again. Even the act of watering was measured. Buckets were filled from the same stone cistern each morning. Each plant received the same rationed ladle of water. No more, no less. Overwatering was seen as indulgent. Underwatering was seen as negligence. The balance was everything. Visitors who passed through sometimes marveled at the calm, the way the monks moved with such deliberate slowness, the way the gravel never seemed out of place. What they didn't see was the pressure, the unspoken demand to maintain that illusion of peace, to perform it, to live it, even if you didn't feel it inside. And when a branch cracked too loudly, or the rake snagged on a hidden stone, or your knees slipped in the wet earth and left a mark in the gravel, there was no outburst, just a pause, a breath. And then you fixed it, quickly, quietly, because stillness wasn't just a goal here. It was a rule. The temple bells had long fallen silent, their echoes consumed by the weight of dusk as it draped itself over the jagged shoulders of the mountains. Evening had settled deep into the stones, curling into corners and stairwells, wrapping the ancient halls in a hush that felt less like calm and more like a held breath. Courtyards stood empty, abandoned by the last of the sunlight, their flagstones cool and slick with creeping shadow. What little light remained came from the lanterns, small, flickering pools that barely reached beyond their own glass. But silence didn't mean peace. Not here. The monks, even now, were not free to rest. In the meditation hall, rows of robed figures knelt motionless, backs ramrod straight despite hours of labor already carved into their muscles. The scent of incense, earthy, bitter, clean, hung heavy, curling in deliberate trails toward the rafters. Outside, the wind tapped gently at the wooden shutters, a persistent guest trying to stir the stillness. Somewhere, a floorboard betrayed the shift of a tired foot and was answered by nothing but the continued rhythm of breath and silence. Evening in the temple was sacred, but it was never soft. Meditation at this hour was not about serenity. It was about discipline, endurance, devotion. It meant sitting with the fire in your knees and the ache in your spine. It meant holding still when your thoughts screamed for distraction, for movement, for sleep. And when posture wavered, when a back curled or shoulders drooped, the keisaku struck, the encouragement stick, a flat, swift reminder across the shoulders. Not punishment, but presence. For some, it was a welcome jolt back into awareness. For others, it was just another sting to swallow. Either way, it came. Elsewhere, down the narrow halls and beyond the steam-choked kitchens, young novices scrubbed pots under the dim glow of oil lamps. Their hands, already blistered from the morning's labor, moved with mechanical determination. The scent of scorched rice still lingered above, mingling with ash and smoke and sweat. The rhythm was familiar. Wash, rinse, stack. No voices, no praise, just the expectation of quiet efficiency. To fall behind meant starting over. To fail meant correction, and not the gentle kind. Elders paced the halls like sentinels, robes rustling across polished wood. They moved without hurry, but with purpose, checking every door latch, every lantern wick, every shadow too deep to be trusted. This wasn't micromanagement. It was duty. Vigilance was part of the vow. The temple's peace had to be guarded, not just from the wild boars that sometimes wandered in from the forest, or the occasional thief hoping for coin or rice, but from forgetfulness, from the small cracks where chaos crept in. And when at last the hour allowed for sleep, it wasn't rest so much as pause. Sleep was regulated, sparse, and earned. Thin tatami mats were unrolled in neat rows. There were no pillows, no extra blankets, just cloth, floor, and cold. Bodies settled without ceremony. No good nights, no small talk, only breath and prayer. Before eyes closed, each monk offered a final thought to the dark, a quiet wish not for comfort, but for strength to endure what the next day demanded. Because peace in this world wasn't a blessing. It was a test. It was something you carved out of the noise, chiseled from pain, and held with calloused hands. And even as the night deepened, thick, black, absolute, the path remained, waiting, demanding. There was no end to it, only the next step. Even within the quiet, incense-scented halls of ancient Japanese monasteries, where vows of peace and simplicity were etched not just into stone and scroll, but into the rhythm of daily life, power never fully disappeared. It simply learned how to bow. By the time a monk had spent long years immersed in sacred texts, perfecting the cadence of chants and folding himself into the stillness of meditation, he was expected to embody humility, detachment, and spiritual clarity. But beneath that serene surface, behind each bowed head and folded robe, lay a hidden world pulsing with quiet competition and the constant, subtle negotiation of hierarchy. Elders held sway over the younger initiates, not solely by virtue of enlightenment or superior wisdom, but more often through tenure, careful alliances, and strategic silence. Advancement within the order didn't always reward piety or scholarship. Instead, it often favored those who understood how to navigate the currents of influence with grace. A single well-placed compliment during a tea ceremony, a thoughtful remark offered at the right moment during a temple council, a gesture of humility that doubled as a political move. These seemingly innocuous interactions carried weight. Influence moved slowly, spreading like ink through rice paper, deliberate, patient, but always spreading. Monks did not raise their voices. There were no angry declarations echoing through temple corridors. Yet that did not mean the monastery was free of argument. Disagreements over doctrine, interpretation, and ritual often took the shape of marathon debates, where silence could be as potent as speech. These philosophical duels, waged in whispers and quotations, could last days. A single flawed citation of a sutra or an ill-considered interpretation of a parable might be remembered and quietly held against you for years. These weren't casual disputes. They were battles for intellectual dominance, for social standing, and occasionally for control over sacred texts, ceremonial duties, or even the division of offerings from patrons. Even the physical layout of the temple grounds wasn't safe from tension. The arrangement of gardens, the positioning of sacred stones, the sequencing and duration of rituals, all became arenas where ideology met ambition. The design of a sand pattern, or the selection of seasonal flowers, could spark deeper conflicts about tradition, modernity, and authority. Outwardly serene, every path and placement told a story of influence. Choosing the wrong style of brushstroke in calligraphy could cost you your standing. Supporting the wrong interpretation of a chant might relegate you to months of menial chores. Align with the wrong abbot, and your dreams of becoming a respected teacher or temple leader could vanish like incense in the wind. And through all of it, silence reigned. No doors were slammed, no accusations shouted, only the quiet shuffle of sandals, the whisper of robes against stone floors, and the occasional cough interrupting the thick air of restraint. A bowed head could signal deference or conceal resentment. A pause before speaking could signify careful thought, or the weighing of political risk. In this world, stillness was a tool. Silence was language. And every moment you spent meditating, someone else might be planning their next subtle move up the invisible ladder. This was not a life free from ambition. It was ambition transmuted into ritual, refined into etiquette, and hidden behind layers of formality and tradition. Within the serene walls of the monastery, the game of influence never stopped. It simply adapted, becoming a slow, deliberate dance of posture, presence, and quiet ruthlessness. A sacred performance where the stakes were your future, your role, and your voice. Monks in ancient Japan may have taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but those vows didn't shield them from the relentless grind of physical labor. The image of a serene monk, lost in silent meditation or elegantly copying sacred scrolls, is only part of the truth. In many monasteries, especially those in remote or poorer regions, monastic life was shaped just as much by calloused hands and aching muscles as it was by chanting and contemplation. Most temples were designed to be self-sufficient communities. Everything a monk needed, food, clothing, ink, even the tools used in daily life, had to be produced and maintained within the temple grounds. There were no hired workers, no servants, no outsiders to lean on. If a path needed sweeping or a wall needed patching, a monk did it. The day began well before sunrise, often with the slow ring of a bell calling everyone to wakefulness. After reciting the sutras, there was no retreat into silence or rest. Instead, the day opened into a stretch of physical obligation, tending fields, hauling water, stacking wood. The rice paddies were unforgiving. Planting was done by hand, ankle-deep in cold mud, often in the drizzle or under the glare of the sun. Harvest season was even more intense. Long hours of bending, cutting, bundling. There were no days off, no allowances made for exhaustion or soreness. And rice wasn't the only crop. Vegetables were cultivated in smaller gardens, each demanding its own care and weeding. Trees had to be pruned seasonally, paths cleared daily, and roofs patched after every storm. Water didn't flow from a faucet. It had to be carried from streams or wells, sometimes located far from the temple itself. Monks made these treks with Wooden buckets, careful not to spill a drop. Firewood, too, was a daily necessity, especially in winter. Chopping it required precision and strength. Storing it meant organizing it carefully to keep it dry and accessible. Meals were cooked over open fires in oversized clay pots. The process wasn't creative. It was ritualistic, demanding silence, patience, and precision. Ingredients were simple, and the meals were spare. Rice gruel, pickled vegetables, miso soup. Once cooked, the food was offered in silence, eaten in silence, and cleaned up in silence. And cleaning was its own ordeal. Dishes were scrubbed not with soap, which was scarce and costly, but with ash, sand, and elbow grease. Floors had to be wiped down with cloths, walls dusted, tatami mats shaken and realigned. Monks rotated duties regularly, and none were spared. One week you might be in the kitchen, the next, cleaning the communal latrines. That job was as grim as it sounds. Waste was scooped, transported, and buried. The stench was overwhelming, especially in summer. A cloth tied around the mouth helped, but not much. You didn't complain. You just did it. In the winter months, everything became harder. Cold crept through thin walls. Water jugs froze solid. Breathing felt like inhaling knives. Fingers split from the dryness and cold, and bare feet stiffened against the icy floors. Even the ink used for copying sutras would thicken and resist the brush. Yet nothing stopped. Monks continued their chores, bundled in layers if they had them, warming hands by brief contact with fire before moving on to the next task. Fires had to be kept alive day and night, not just for comfort, but for survival. Often monks would sleep in shifts near the hearth to keep the flames going. Writing and studying, often idealized as peaceful pursuits, were far from restful. Copying sutras required hours of sitting in fixed positions, with little to no movement. The light was dim, lanterns or slivers of sun through small windows. Ink was made from soot and glue, thick and pungent. The brush had to be cleaned constantly. Every stroke had to be perfect. A single smudge or miswritten character meant starting again. This wasn't art, it was endurance. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Monks lived communally, sharing sleeping quarters, bathing areas, toilets. Bathing was rare and usually cold. Changing clothes happened quickly, discreetly, often while still damp from the previous day's sweat. Modesty wasn't just a virtue, it was an adaptation. The body was not sacred. Comfort was not a priority. Humility was taught not through sermons, but through daily grind. Through all of this, monks were expected to maintain mindfulness. Every swing of the hoe, every load of wood, every moment spent squatting in the garden or scrubbing the latrine. These were moments for presence, for gratitude. Pain wasn't an interruption. Hunger wasn't a distraction. Cold wasn't a mistake. They were all teachers. Despite the popular image of monks as detached from the world, their lives were grounded in the very elements of it: dirt, heat, cold, hunger, pain. That was the paradox. They sought peace, not by escaping hardship, but by walking straight into it, and finding stillness there. The mountains rose jagged and silent beyond the mist, their outlines softened by the early morning fog that clung to the slopes like old silk. Somewhere along those winding ridges, tucked beneath groves of pine, cedar, and the gnarled limbs of weather-bent trees, sat a monastery older than the road that led to it. This was no showpiece of devotion with golden roofs and bustling courtyards. It was plain, worn down by centuries of wind and snow, its stones dark with age, its wooden beams groaning in the cold, its silence deeper than any library. The monks who lived here had abandoned the courts of emperors and the chatter of common folk. They did not come seeking serenity, nor were they cloistered scholars cultivating calligraphy in gardens. These men followed a harsher path, one carved from discipline, denial, and endurance. This was a sect of extremes. Isolation was their foundation, fasting their rhythm, pain their teacher. The rules were not just firm, they were iron. Days began in darkness. Before the sun had even lifted above the peaks, the monks were already outside, chopping wood with blistered hands, hauling buckets of water up slick, frozen paths, patching torn roofs with frost still clinging to the shingles. Winter turned the monastery into a prison of ice. Snow pressed against the sliding doors like a silent weight. Water froze solid in the communal basins, and the breath of each monk fogged the air inside the stone-walled sleeping quarters. The floors were unforgiving. Even straw mats provided little comfort. The wind, a sharp, biting thing that sliced between the boards, never rested. Some monks wrapped their hands in cloth, not for warmth, but to prevent the skin from splitting when they handled scrolls or turned pages. Sandals were woven from straw and worn until they fell apart. Frostbite was not uncommon, but no one complained. Complaining was seen as indulgence. Meals were simple and few. A small bowl of millet porridge, often watery and tasteless. Maybe a sliver of pickled radish. Tea, steeped weekly, was more ceremony than nourishment. Conversation during meals was forbidden. Silence wasn't a punishment. It was the practice. Words, they believed, had weight. To use them thoughtlessly was to waste them. Some monks went 10 days or more without speaking aloud. The quiet, instead of bringing peace, deepened the focus. It demanded attention. Meditation wasn't a reprieve from the harshness. It was another form of it. It stretched on for hours, legs folded tight, spine upright, eyes half closed but alert. No movement, no adjusting, no drifting off. If a monk fidgeted, if he nodded off, he would feel the sudden strike of the kyosaku, the flat wooden staff used not as punishment but as correction. It stung. It startled. It kept the body in line and the mind present. Over time, the silence and structure carved these men into something unshakable, not soft, not joyful, not serene, but strong, still, like the rocks that lined their pathways, like the icicles that clung to the eaves. Their peace was not comfort. It was control. And while the world below changed with each new war, each shifting alliance between rival daimyo, each fire that scorched a city or temple, the monks remained. They breathed mountain air. They recited old verses. They walked paths, worn down by generations. They endured, not because they were untouched by the world, but because they had chosen to meet it in a different way. Not with violence or ambition, but with silence, pain, and purpose. The temple bell had long since faded into the evening hush, swallowed by the thick quiet that blanketed the monastery like mist rolling in over distant hills. The corridors, lined with wooden beams darkened by age and incense smoke, were now deep in shadow. Oil lamps flickered dimly, their flames dancing in small, uneven rhythms, casting fleeting halos that shimmered across the polished floors. A cool breeze threaded through cracks in the wooden walls, stirring the faint smell of old tatami and sandalwood. By now the monks had completed their evening rites. The last chant had drifted into silence. The final prayers murmured with bowed heads before they each returned to the small austerity of their sleeping quarters. The hush that followed felt almost unnatural, so complete that it seemed as if the monastery itself had been carved from stillness. But even here, in this cloistered pocket of serenity, the night was not merely for rest. It was part of the work. Sleep came, yes, but only for those not bound to further vigil. For a monk in ancient Japan, the end of daylight did not release one from duty. It only shifted the shape of that duty. While most laid down on their thin bedding, wrapped in simple cloth against the deepening cold, others remained wakeful. Some sat in quiet corners, scrolls unrolled before them, their fingers slowly tracing elegant kanji, committing the words to memory in silence. The teachings of the ancients were never finished, only revisited, layer by layer. In distant halls, a few monks sat in the lotus position, backs rigid, eyes lowered in half-closed focus. Practicing zazen, seated meditation, they tuned their senses inward, seeking to dissolve thought entirely. They measured their breath like one might count the grains of rice in a bowl, slowly and without end. Time itself lost meaning, reduced to the slow ebb of the oil lamp's wick and the rhythm of the body's stillness. For those assigned to the night watch, rest would come later, if at all. These monks patrolled the grounds with quiet purpose, their straw sandals whispering over stone and dirt. They passed beneath the sweeping eaves of the temple buildings, checking that gates were properly latched, lanterns untouched, offerings in the shrine undisturbed. Every creak in the wood, every gust of wind through bamboo, every distant rustle in the underbrush demanded attention. The monastery may have been a sanctuary of order, but it was not immune to the world beyond its walls, to intruders, to fire, to the slow decay of time. There were others too, those trained not only to watch the monastery, but to watch themselves, even in sleep, the dream watchers. Through years of spiritual discipline, they had learned to become conscious within their dreams, to observe their minds while adrift in sleep. They believed that dreams were illusions of the ego, masks worn by fear, desire, and memory. To face those illusions was part of the path. Mastery wasn't achieved only in waking contemplation, but in the secret, slippery realms of the subconscious. This wasn't mysticism to them. It was responsibility, a spiritual frontier to be crossed nightly. As the hours passed, the temperature dropped. The stillness grew deeper, more profound. Crickets sang outside in a chorus that rose and fell like waves. A bamboo water fountain tilted with a soft thunk and reset itself, marking time not in minutes, but in moments. The garden shimmered with moonlight, and the shadows of pine trees stretched long across stone paths. The monastery appeared to sleep, but inside, not all eyes were closed. Some watched the flicker of lamps, guarding against the unknown. Some listened inward, beyond thought. Others let their minds slip into dreams, ready to face what they found there. Being a monk in ancient Japan wasn't about fleeing the world. It was about confronting it, in silence, in ritual, and in solitude. Every hour, even the quietest, was a trial, a test of endurance, of faith, and of purpose. Even in the stillness of night, something within had to remain sharp, alert, and unwavering. So, while the villages slept and the hills lay draped in shadow, the monastery held its breath. A world of rustling robes, flickering flame, and breath drawn slow and quiet. A world watching itself. Outside the temple walls, Japan was changing, and not in ways that made the quiet life of a monk any easier. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the world beyond the monasteries began to encroach on the silence that monks had tried so carefully to protect. The once isolated temples, nestled in forests or perched high in the mountains, began to feel the pull of something louder, something harder to ignore. War had scarred the countryside. Villages smoldered in the aftermath of raids. Soldiers and bandits alike claimed the roads. Safe paths became treacherous, and even the most secluded monasteries couldn't pretend the world outside didn't exist. Traveling monks saw it all firsthand. Their roles often took them far from the safety of temple gates, through valleys scarred by conflict, past burned-out homes and deserted farms, and into towns where hunger had hollowed the people. Some walked into silence, villages abandoned, fields overgrown. Others passed through areas so raw with grief that even offering blessings felt inadequate. The trauma they absorbed wasn't physical. It was the heaviness that settled into the chest and refused to leave, a haunting, carried from place to place. And even when swords were sheathed and the air no longer smelled of smoke, peace itself made demands. Local lords, powerful and proud, turned to temples for validation. Patronage came with strings. A temple that refused to bless a lord's ambitions might find its rice shipments delayed. A monk who spoke too plainly could disappear. Temples walked a tightrope between spiritual duty and political survival. Some were co-opted into supporting wars through ritual. Others found themselves dragged into land disputes, pressed into the role of judge between two armed factions, both expecting divine endorsement. Nature, too, showed little mercy. Monasteries often stood in places chosen for isolation, not safety. Floods washed away mountain paths. Landslides crushed meditation huts. Wild animals prowled the edges of rice paddies. In the depths of winter, food stores dwindled, and monks wrapped themselves in thin robes, sharing warmth around smoky fires. In summer, the air turned thick and oppressive, meditation halls becoming furnaces. Water grew stagnant, illness spread. Yet the bells rang each morning. Chants echoed through halls. Bodies weakened, but rituals continued. The path left no room for pause. But the cruelest challenge was not war or nature. It was indifference. As the world moved on, as new ideas flowed into port cities and merchant wealth redrew the lines of influence, the old rhythms of temple life began to feel out of step. Young people turned toward opportunities in bustling towns. Foreign teachings, new philosophies, and economic dreams lured them away from quiet contemplation. Temples emptied. Scrolls went unread. Statues of bodhisattvas stood watch over prayer rooms that no longer filled. Silence, once sacred, became hollow. Monks wrestled with the change. Some clung tighter to tradition, repeating every ritual with stubborn reverence. Others questioned the value of vows made to a world that had forgotten them. Was seclusion still noble, or had it become cowardice in the face of a changing age? Could silence still be wisdom when no one was left to hear it? And yet, morning came. The sky lightened. The cold floor met bare feet. Voices rose in chant. Paths were swept. Scrolls were opened. The questions remained. So did the uncertainty. But so did the monks, because being a monk wasn't about having answers. It wasn't about being heard. It was about enduring. Through war, through silence, through irrelevance. It was about rising again, praying again, chanting, even when the world had turned away, chanting anyway. At the edge of a forest blanketed in mist, far from the rising sun that lit the pagodas and tiled rooftops of the distant capital, a lone monastery stood, shrouded in quiet and cut off from the urgency of the outside world. Here, time did not pass in hours or days. It crept forward like moss growing over stone, like the slow fading of ink on centuries-old scrolls. Seasons were the clock. Crumbling steps worn down by sandaled feet were the calendar. The world had slowed to a hum so low you could only feel it if you stayed still long enough. The monks who lived this far from civilization were often older. Their robes were faded to the color of old clay, patched and softened from years of wear. Their hair had long since thinned or vanished altogether. They moved deliberately, slowly, but there was grace in it, a deep rhythm of repetition honed over a lifetime. These men had given up ambition in favor of discipline, conversation in favor of contemplation. Their voices, when used at all, were gentle as breath, rare as windless days. Daily life in the monastery was stripped of everything but necessity. The morning began before the first hint of sunlight. Rise, bow, light incense, chant the same sacred syllables spoken by countless mouths over generations. Tend to the tiny garden, pluck weeds from between the stones, sweep the pathways as if clearing the mind itself, repair tiles torn loose by storms and time. Meals were humble, just enough rice to fill the stomach, maybe a strip of dried seaweed or a few pickled vegetables. Often eaten alone, in silence. The days didn't build toward anything. They repeated not just for a season or a few years, but for decades, for entire lifetimes. A loop with no exit. It would be easy to assume this meant peace. But peace is not guaranteed by silence. In fact, for many monks, silence was its own battlefield. Loneliness pressed in like fog. Thick, invisible, difficult to shake. Some monks had turned their backs on families, on lovers, on past lives filled with complexity and human contact. And though the body could adapt to new routines, the mind was harder to quiet. Guilt lingered. Doubt crept in. In the emptiness of the halls, thoughts echoed louder than any spoken word, bouncing off ancient stones, refusing to disappear. The forest surrounded the monastery like a living wall, and the wind carried more than just birdsong and the creak of ancient trees. Sometimes it brought memory, sometimes regret. Occasionally, a monk might swear he heard laughter or weeping somewhere just beyond the trees. Hallucination, maybe. Or maybe the soul's way of reminding the body of what it had tried to forget. Some monks spent entire afternoons staring at a single drop of water forming slowly at the edge of a cracked basin, watching it swell, tremble, and finally fall. And then another. Hours could pass this way, without movement or distraction. Just stillness. Until even the act of watching ceased to matter. This life, isolated and rhythmic, was not easier for its quiet. It asked more than most could give. It required not just discipline, but endurance of the invisible. Where soldiers faced enemies of flesh and blood, these monks faced themselves, their doubts, their memories, their unfinished stories. The monastery did not shield them from suffering. It revealed new kinds. And in that revelation, in that echoing silence and endless repetition, they searched not for glory or redemption, but for the kind of peace that does not come easy, the kind that must be earned inside the silence. For many, that was the most difficult trial of all. The bell tolls softly in the distance, just once, long and lingering like a breath drawn deep across the rooftops of the temple grounds. Its echo fades slowly, swallowed by the night. By now, most of the monastery has settled into its hush. The fire in the central hall has burned low, reduced to a soft scatter of glowing coals. The last of the chants have been murmured into the wooden beams. The polished floors have been swept clean. Offerings of rice and incense have been placed with care. The world, within this little sanctuary, has fallen into stillness. A monk, now bent slightly with age, sits at the edge of the moonlit garden. His robes are worn and threadbare. His hands, calloused and lined, rest gently on his knees. His gaze is steady, calm, though heavy with the weight of decades. Not every monk reaches this stage. Many are lost to war, to fever, to accidents along perilous roads. But those who remain do not merely grow old. They absorb time. They hold memory like water in stone, of flooded paddies and dry harvests, of long pilgrimages up forested hills, of nights spent transcribing sacred text by candlelight until the wax clung to their fingertips. The silence that surrounds him now is not like the early morning quiet demanded during meditation. This is something different. It isn't enforced. It isn't structured. It's a silence that's been earned. It has texture, depth, a kind of warmth. It doesn't come from isolation. It comes from surviving the noise. This monk doesn't speak. He listens to the breeze sifting over roof tiles, to the distant murmur of a stream, to the rhythmic song of crickets hidden in tall grass. His breathing is measured and deep, his posture firm but relaxed, like a tree rooted in wind. Behind him, the younger monks sleep soundly in their shared quarters, their breathing soft, their limbs curled beneath coarse blankets. Some dream of transcendence, some dream of family they haven't seen in years. Some do not dream at all. Each of them, over time, will come to grasp the truth. The older monk already knows in his bones. Peace isn't something monks are given. It isn't handed down with a robe or acquired through recitation. Peace is something they build, slowly, patiently, through trial, through rhythm, through discomfort embraced day after day. It is a practice, a craft, not a destination. Beyond the thick wooden gates of the monastery, the world groans under the weight of its own unrest. Lords gather armies and lose them in days. Fields blacken under failing rains. Provinces fracture beneath rebellion or ambition. Roads fill with displaced families, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. And yet here, inside these quiet walls, a cup of tea rests untouched beside a slatted screen door. A single moth circles near the last flicker of flame. The monk sits, exhales, and with that breath, allows the remains of the day to pass from his shoulders into the dark. This is not a tale of retreat. It never has been. It's a story about choosing presence when escape would be easier, of finding dignity in daily ritual, of shaping a life not untouched by hardship, but deepened by it. Here, strength is measured not in might, but in how often one returns to the mat, to the verse, to the stillness, especially when there's no one to witness it. Most monks are not remembered. Their names vanish like ink faded by time, but their work, quiet, invisible, enduring, lives on. In the uneven stones beneath bare feet, in the worn spines of scrolls tucked away in forgotten shelves, in chants that echo through corridors where no voices remain. Now rest. Let the day fall behind you. The bells will sleep too, until morning stirs them again.